The moment I heard my wife say I was easy to replace, I didn't argue. I just started paying attention. Not the kind of attention that comes from anger or panic, but the kind that makes everything around you feel slower, clearer, like the world is finally speaking in sentences you can understand. My name is Daniel Carter, and I've spent enough years working in corporate logistics to know when something is being said casually but meant completely. That night, Jessica didn't raise her voice. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even look at me when she said it. She just said it the way someone comments on the weather. Like I was a detail she had already filed away and stopped caring about. We were sitting in our Chicago apartment, the kind of place that looks impressive from the outside. Glass view, clean lines, expensive silence, but feels different when you're actually inside it long enough. There was a time when we used to talk about everything, small things, big things, nothing things that somehow mattered. But lately, conversations had turned into short exchanges, updates, logistics, reminders. That night, she was on her phone more than she was present in the room, scrolling through messages that made her smile in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. I remember asking her a simple question about dinner plans, something normal, something routine, and she barely looked up when she answered. That was when she said it, almost absent-mindedly, like she was continuing a thought I wasn't part of. "You're easy to replace, Daniel. Honestly, I already know someone who fits better into my life right now." There was no pause after it, no dramatic silence, just the sound of her tapping her screen again, like the conversation had already ended. I didn't ask who she meant. I didn't ask why. I didn't even ask if she was serious, because something in her tone told me she was past the point of needing to explain herself. Instead, I just watched her for a moment, trying to recognize the person I used to think I knew. The room felt the same, but everything in it had shifted slightly, like a photograph that's been tilted just enough to feel wrong. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water I didn't drink. That was my reaction. No anger, no pleading, no reaction she could measure or use. Just silence. Later that night, after she had gone to bed without saying goodnight, I sat alone in the dark living room and replayed the sentence in my head, not because it hurt less the second time, but because I needed to understand why it didn't surprise me more. Somewhere between her promotion at Atlas Dynamics and the long nights she started spending at the office, something had shifted between us. I just hadn't labeled it yet. But the next morning, she did something that made it impossible to ignore. She asked me to come to her office after work, like it was a formality, like we were scheduling a conversation that had already ended. And the way she said it, calm and certain, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a conclusion waiting for me to arrive. Daniel Carter did not respond right away after Jessica Carter told him to come to her office after work. He simply nodded, as if the request carried no emotional weight, and returned to his routine as though nothing had changed. But something had changed, and he could feel it in the way the air in their apartment seemed quieter, more calculated, like even silence had started taking sides. The next morning, Jessica left earlier than usual, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked like it belonged more to her office than their life together. She did not mention the previous night, and Daniel did not force the subject. Instead, he observed. He noticed how she checked her phone before even finishing her coffee, how her attention was already elsewhere before her day had even begun. After she left, Daniel stood by the kitchen counter for a long time, staring at the empty space she had occupied, not in sadness, but in recognition. Something in him had already shifted into observation mode, a habit he had developed years ago in business negotiations where the loudest move was often the one not made. That afternoon, he went to work at his consulting firm in downtown Chicago, a place where numbers, contracts, and structural decisions mattered more than emotions. His colleagues greeted him as usual, unaware of anything beneath the surface. Daniel presented himself the same way he always had, calm, precise, dependable. But internally, he was processing something different. He began reviewing accounts and partnership structures that most people in the office never bothered to fully understand, documents that had his signature in places they rarely asked about. He did not act on anything, but he noticed everything. When the clock approached late afternoon, he left his office earlier than usual. The drive toward Jessica's company felt different this time, not because of anger or fear, but because of clarity. The streets of Chicago were busy with after-work traffic, horns blending into a steady urban rhythm. But Daniel remained steady behind the wheel, focused on a simple truth. Tonight was not about confrontation, it was about finality. Jessica worked at Atlas Dynamics, a corporate marketing firm located in a glass tower near the river, a building Daniel had visited only a few times before. Each time, it had felt like stepping into a different ecosystem, one where image mattered more than substance, and perception often replaced reality. As he parked across the street, he noticed how the building reflected the fading daylight, turning it into something almost artificial, like a polished version of success. He checked the time once, then exited the vehicle without hesitation. Inside, the lobby was bright, clean, and deliberately intimidating, filled with polished floors and quiet security presence. Daniel approached the front desk and stated his name in a calm voice, requesting to be directed to Jessica Carter's floor. The receptionist hesitated only briefly before making the call upward. As Daniel waited, he felt no urgency, only a steady sense of alignment, as if every step he had taken over the past months had been moving toward this exact moment. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and he stepped inside alone, watching the doors close slowly in front of him. On the elevator display, the numbers climbed steadily, and for the first time, Daniel felt not uncertainty, but the quiet certainty that whatever waited on that floor had already been decided long before he arrived. Daniel Carter stepped out of the elevator as the doors opened on the 32nd floor of Atlas Dynamics, and the atmosphere immediately shifted from the quiet mechanical movement of the building into something sharper, more intentional. The hallway was lined with glass walls and soft lighting that gave everything a polished, almost controlled feeling, like every conversation inside had already been rehearsed before it began. He adjusted his pace, walking forward without hesitation, as if he belonged there just as much as anyone else. At the end of the corridor, he saw the reception area where Jessica Carter stood speaking with two colleagues, her posture confident, her expression composed, the same professional mask she wore everywhere in this environment. When she noticed him, there was the slightest pause, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but Daniel caught it immediately. "You came early," she said, her tone steady but carrying a hint of surprise. She quickly covered. "I assumed we agreed after work hours," Daniel replied calmly, his voice even, without emotion. A few nearby employees glanced over briefly, sensing something unusual but unable to place it. Jessica stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Let's not do this here," she said, gesturing toward a conference room down the hall. Daniel nodded once and followed without resistance. As they walked, he observed everything around him, the glass offices, the branded displays, the constant movement of employees who looked focused but detached, all part of a system that ran on appearance and efficiency. When they entered the conference room, the atmosphere changed again. Inside, seated at the long table, was Mark Sullivan, the chief executive officer of Atlas Dynamics, reviewing documents with a calm, unreadable expression. Jessica closed the door behind them and immediately turned toward Daniel. "If this is about last night, I already said what needed to be said," she began, her voice firm, trying to maintain control of the situation. Daniel remained standing for a moment before slowly taking a seat across from her, placing his hands together on the table. "This is not about last night," he said quietly. "This is about the meeting you requested." The room went still for a brief moment. Mark Sullivan looked up from the documents, his eyes studying Daniel with a level of recognition that Jessica did not notice. Daniel continued, his tone steady and measured. "You asked me to come here because you wanted clarity. I am here to provide it." Jessica frowned slightly, sensing something was off in the way he spoke, as if he was following a structure she had not anticipated. "Clarity about what exactly?" she asked. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the folder in front of Mark Sullivan, then back at Jessica. "About the decisions that have already been made regarding your position and the structure of your department moving forward," he said. The words landed softly, but the weight behind them changed the atmosphere in the room. Jessica straightened, her confidence starting to shift. "My position has nothing to do with you," she said quickly. Daniel finally met her eyes directly. "It has everything to do with this meeting," he replied. Mark Sullivan closed the folder slowly, interjecting for the first time. "Jessica, we should continue this conversation in private," he said calmly. standing up and gesturing toward a smaller adjoining office. Jessica hesitated, then followed as Daniel rose and moved with them without urgency. As the door to the smaller room closed behind them, Daniel paused for a brief moment, his gaze steady, his voice calm but precise as he said, "Before we begin, there is something you both need to understand." The moment Daniel Carter finished speaking, the small conference room inside Atlas Dynamics seemed to tighten, as if the air itself was adjusting to the weight of what had just been said. Jessica Carter stood near the glass wall with her arms crossed, trying to maintain the same composed expression she had carried throughout the morning, but something subtle had shifted in her posture. Mark Sullivan remained seated, hands resting lightly on the table, observing Daniel with the kind of attention reserved for situations that no longer felt routine. Daniel did not rush to explain himself. Instead, he slowly placed a thin folder onto the table, aligning it carefully, as if every centimeter mattered. "This is not a conversation about emotion," Daniel said in a calm, even voice. "It is a conversation about structure, authorization, and execution of terms that were finalized over 3 quarters ago." Jessica frowned slightly, glancing toward Mark Sullivan as if searching for confirmation that this was not going where she feared it might go. "I do not understand what you are implying," she said, her tone sharper now, but less stable than before. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging her words without reacting to their edge. "You do understand," he replied quietly. "You just did not expect it to surface in this way." He opened the folder and slid a set of documents forward. Inside were pages of corporate agreements, signed authorizations, and structural adjustments tied to departmental oversight within Atlas Dynamics. Jessica leaned in slightly, scanning the pages, her eyes moving faster with each line. Mark Sullivan remained silent, his expression shifting only once as he reached the section highlighted in blue. Daniel continued, his voice steady and precise. "When your department expanded into the West Coast accounts, additional governance clauses were activated. They were not designed for daily operations. They were designed for oversight transitions." Jessica looked up immediately. "Oversight transitions of what exactly?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze directly for the first time without hesitation. "Control," he said simply. The word lingered in the room longer than expected. Jessica straightened, her confidence beginning to fracture at the edges. "You are saying you have authority over my department?" she asked, disbelief mixing with rising tension. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly toward Mark Sullivan. "I am saying the board ratified a conditional authority structure that becomes active under performance review triggers and internal reassessment thresholds," he said calmly. Mark Sullivan finally spoke, his tone controlled but definitive. "That is correct," he said. Jessica turned toward him sharply. "You approve this?" she asked. Mark did not look away. "It was already in motion before today's meeting," he replied. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer uncertainty, but realization. Jessica looked back at Daniel, her expression shifting between confusion and disbelief. "So this was planned," she said slowly. Daniel shook his head once. "No," he replied. "It was prepared." He closed the folder gently, as if concluding a point that had been settled long before anyone entered the room. "You told me I was easy to replace," he continued. "I did not argue with that assessment because it was never the correct question." Jessica's voice lowered. "Then what is the correct question?" Daniel paused for a moment, letting the silence settle fully before answering. "Who actually had the authority to make that decision in the first place?" The room fell completely still. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving at its usual pace, unaware of the shift taking place inside. Jessica looked at the documents again, this time more carefully, as if seeing them for the first time. Mark Sullivan remained quiet, watching her process the implications unfold. Daniel stood slowly, adjusting his posture, his tone unchanged. "This meeting was never about confrontation," he said. "It was about alignment with reality." He turned slightly toward the door, then paused. Jessica opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out immediately. Daniel looked back once, not with anger or satisfaction, but with final clarity. "Everything you believed was replaceable," he said calmly, "was never under your control to begin with." The silence inside the Atlas Dynamics conference room did not break immediately after Daniel Carter finished speaking. It settled deeper instead, becoming heavier, more intentional, as if every person inside had just realized the conversation was no longer operating on familiar ground. Jessica Carter remained standing near the glass wall, her arms now lowered, her expression no longer composed in the way she had carefully maintained earlier. There was something unfamiliar in her eyes, not panic. Exactly, but the first clear absence of control she had felt in a long time. Mark Sullivan stayed seated, his hands folded, his attention fixed on the documents in front of him, as though confirming details that had already been reviewed but now carried a different weight under new context. Daniel did not move toward the door immediately. Instead, he took a step back toward the table, as if ensuring that what came next was fully understood rather than rushed. "This is not a surprise event," Daniel said calmly, his voice measured and steady. "This is the final stage of a process that began long before today." Jessica turned slightly toward him, her voice lower now, less certain. "You are talking as if I was never part of my own department," she said. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the question without reacting emotionally. "You were part of the operation," he replied. "But operational involvement is not the same as structural authority." He paused briefly, letting the distinction settle. Mark Sullivan finally looked up from the documents, his tone carefully controlled. "Jessica," he said, "these agreements were tied to performance oversight clauses approved during expansion review cycles. They are standard in high-level restructuring frameworks." Jessica shook her head slightly, still trying to process the implications. "I was never informed this could happen," she said. Daniel responded without raising his voice. "You were informed," he said. "You were simply not required to act on it until it activated." That sentence changed the energy in the room again. Jessica looked down at the papers once more, now reading them slower, more carefully, as if searching for something she had previously overlooked. Her fingers moved slightly across the edge of the table, a small gesture that revealed more uncertainty than she intended to show. Daniel continued, his tone remaining even. "When you told me I was easy to replace, you were describing a perception," he said. "Not a structure. Perceptions change. Structures do not." Jessica finally looked directly at him again. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward Mark Sullivan, who gave a subtle nod, as if confirming that the explanation should proceed. Daniel turned back to Jessica. "Now," he said, "the transition phase begins." Jessica frowned slightly. "Transition to what exactly?" she asked. Daniel stepped closer to the table, placing one hand lightly on the edge, not in aggression, but in finality. "Transition of decision-making authority, reporting structure, and project oversight alignment," he said. "All responsibilities previously associated with your role will be reassigned under board supervision until review completion." Jessica let out a slow breath, as if trying to steady herself. "You are removing me," she said, more as realization than accusation. Daniel corrected her gently. "No," he said. "The system is adjusting. Roles are being realigned based on existing frameworks." The distinction, though subtle, made the situation more absolute. Mark Sullivan finally closed the folder in front of him, signaling the formal end of review. "Jessica," he said, "you will receive a full written summary by end of day. Human Resources will coordinate next steps." Jessica did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at Daniel for several seconds, searching for something familiar in him that no longer seemed accessible in the same way. "Was any of this ever about us?" she asked quietly. Daniel held her gaze, his expression unchanged. "It was never about emotion," he said. "It was about structure. You simply did not see the structure until it became visible." He stepped back from the table, turning slightly toward the door again. The room felt different now, not tense, but resolved. Jessica remained standing in the same position, processing what had already been finalized around her. Daniel paused at the doorway for a final moment, then spoke one last time without turning fully back. "Being easy to replace," he said calmly, "was never your mistake. Believing you had the authority to decide that alone was." Then he stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind a silence that no longer needed explanation. Daniel Carter did not rush as he walked down the glass-lined hallway of Atlas Dynamics. His footsteps were steady, unchanging, as if the conversation he had just left behind had already been resolved long before the words were spoken. Behind him, the conference room door remained closed, and inside it, the atmosphere continued to feel heavier than before, not because of anger or confrontation, but because of clarity settling in where uncertainty used to exist. Jessica Carter remained standing for a moment after Daniel left, her gaze fixed on the table where the documents still lay open. The words on the pages no longer felt abstract. They felt final. Mark Sullivan broke the silence first, not with emotion, but with procedure. He reached for the internal phone on the table and requested human resources to join them in the room. Jessica turned slightly toward him, her voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence she had carried earlier. "This was never explained to me in this way," she said. Mark replied evenly. "It was explained in the documentation you acknowledged during onboarding revisions. The framework does not change based on timing of awareness." Jessica looked down again, as if trying to find a version of the situation that made more sense than the one unfolding in front of her. Meanwhile, Daniel stepped into the elevator at the end of the corridor. As the doors closed, he exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in completion. The numbers began to descend, floor by floor, each level taking him further away from the glass, enclosed world above. He did not check his phone immediately. Instead, he simply stood still, allowing the quiet mechanical motion of the elevator to reset his thoughts. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the lobby felt brighter, almost indifferent to what had just taken place above. Daniel walked through it without drawing attention, passing by employees who had no awareness of the shift that had occurred at the executive level just minutes earlier. Outside, Chicago traffic continued as usual, the city moving forward without pause. Daniel crossed the street and returned to his vehicle, sitting inside before finally picking up his phone. There were no missed calls, no urgent messages, only scheduled updates and system notifications tied to corporate approvals that had already been set in motion days earlier. He reviewed them briefly, confirming alignment, then placed the phone down on the passenger seat. Back inside Atlas Dynamics, Jessica had moved from the conference room to a smaller adjacent office with Mark Sullivan and a representative from Human Resources. The conversation was no longer about interpretation. It was about transition procedures, timelines, and formal acknowledgement of structural changes already activated within the organization. Jessica listened in silence, occasionally asking for clarification, but each answer reinforced the same underlying truth. Her role had not been removed in a moment. It had been redefined long before she was aware it could be questioned. As the discussion continued, she found herself replaying Daniel's final words, not as emotion, but as logic she had not fully understood at the time. "Believing you had the authority to decide that alone." The phrase repeated in her mind with increasing weight. Outside the building, Daniel started the engine but did not immediately drive away. Instead, he sat for a moment, looking at the reflection of the glass tower in his side mirror. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no visible relief, only the calm recognition of completion. His phone vibrated once with a message from an internal executive channel confirming that the board had acknowledged the restructuring update. Daniel read it, then set the phone aside again. The city around him continued its normal rhythm, unaware of any disruption. When he finally pulled out into traffic, he did so without hesitation, merging smoothly into the flow of vehicles as if nothing had changed at all, except for the quiet understanding that certain decisions, once executed, did not need to be revisited. Daniel Carter drove through downtown Chicago without changing his pace, even as the city around him began to shift into evening movement. The sunlight reflected off the glass buildings, creating long reflections across the windshield, but his attention remained steady and internal, as if the outside world had become secondary to a process already completed in his mind. He did not replay the meeting from earlier with emotion. Instead, he replayed it with structure, breaking it down the same way he would analyze a business transition that had already passed its critical point. Every statement, every acknowledgement, every silence in that room had aligned exactly as expected. When he reached a stoplight, he glanced briefly at his phone again. There was another notification from Atlas Dynamics internal systems confirming the formal execution of the restructuring protocol. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he placed the phone down and continued driving, maintaining a calm that felt less like reaction and more like continuation. Meanwhile, inside Atlas Dynamics, Jessica Carter remained in the small office adjacent to the conference room with Mark Sullivan and a human resources representative. The conversation had moved past interpretation and into procedural explanation. Documents were being reviewed line by line, timelines were being outlined, and confirmation signatures were being requested to acknowledge receipt of information that had already taken effect. Jessica listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, but each answer reinforced the same underlying framework. Nothing she had experienced in the moment of realization had been sudden in the eyes of the system that governed it. It had simply become visible to her now. At one point, she paused and leaned back slightly in her chair, her expression no longer defensive but distant, as if trying to locate where her understanding of control had begun to separate from operational reality. Mark Sullivan spoke in a calm, professional tone, explaining that her transition period would include standard knowledge transfer procedures, access adjustments, and scheduled reviews over the coming weeks. Jessica nodded slowly, not because she agreed, but because she understood that resistance no longer altered structure. The human resources representative continued outlining next steps, but Jessica's attention drifted for a brief moment back to Daniel's presence earlier in the room, the way he had spoken without hesitation and the way he had not needed to raise his voice to shift the entire direction of the conversation. Outside the building, Daniel parked near the river and sat in silence for a moment. The Chicago skyline reflected across the water, steady and unchanged, as if nothing internal to any of its buildings had shifted at all. He finally picked up his phone again and opened a message thread from an internal advisory channel. A brief confirmation had been sent indicating that all governance adjustments had been logged and synchronized across departments. Daniel read it once, then closed the screen. There was no need for further action. Everything that required execution had already been executed. He leaned back slightly in his seat, resting his hands on the steering wheel without tension, and for the first time that day, allowed himself to simply observe the city without assigning meaning to it. Inside Atlas Dynamics, Jessica signed her acknowledgement documents, her hand steady but slower than usual. Each signature represented not agreement, but recognition of a system that had already moved beyond the point of negotiation. When she finished, she set the pen down and remained still for a moment, staring at the papers in front of her. The room around her continued its professional rhythm, voices soft, procedural language ongoing. But internally, she felt a separation forming between what she had believed was stable and what had always been structured beneath it. Daniel, meanwhile, started his car again and merged into traffic along the riverfront, moving forward without urgency, as if the entire sequence of events had simply returned him to a state of quiet continuity rather than change. Jessica Carter left the Atlas Dynamics office suite with the signed documents held neatly in her hand, but for the first time in years, she did not feel the usual sense of control she associated with corporate environments. The hallway outside the conference room felt longer than before, as if the space itself had subtly changed its meaning after what had been finalized inside. Employees passed by her with polite nods, but she noticed something different in their behavior now. A slight hesitation in eye contact, a delay. An acknowledgement that suggested they were already aware of a shift she had only just begun to fully understand. Behind her, the human resources representative continued speaking in a calm voice, outlining access adjustments and transition timelines, but Jessica's attention drifted between words and implications. Every explanation she heard confirmed the same underlying truth, that the decisions made in that room were not reactions but executions of a structure that had existed independently of her awareness. As she reached the elevator, she paused for a brief moment, staring at her reflection in the polished metal doors, noticing how composed she still appeared on the surface despite the internal recalibration happening beneath it. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter continued driving along the Chicago riverfront, the city lights beginning to reflect across the water as evening deepened. His phone remained on the passenger seat, vibrating occasionally with system notifications, but he did not reach for it immediately. When he finally did, it was not to engage but to confirm. A formal message from Atlas Dynamics Governance Systems indicated that the restructuring had been fully ratified and recorded across all relevant departments. Daniel read it once, then placed the phone back down without reaction, as though the confirmation simply matched an outcome that had already been settled earlier in the day. In that moment, there was no sense of victory or loss, only alignment between intention and execution. Jessica stepped into the elevator alone, watching the doors close as the office floor disappeared behind her. The descent felt slower than usual, not physically, but perceptually, as if her mind was processing layers of realization faster than the environment could respond. She replayed Daniel's words from earlier, not as confrontation, but as explanation she had not been positioned to interpret correctly at the time. The phrase about authority, structure, and decision-making returned again, no longer sounding abstract, but precise. When the elevator reached the ground floor, she walked out into the lobby, noticing for the first time how the building no longer felt like a place she operated within, but a system she had been temporarily positioned inside of. Outside, Chicago's evening traffic continued without interruption. Daniel parked near the river again, this time remaining in the vehicle longer, watching the flow of cars and pedestrians move with indifferent consistency. His phone lit up with a brief incoming call from an internal executive line, but he did not answer. Instead, he allowed it to ring out, recognizing that all necessary communication had already been completed through formal channels. A second notification arrived moments later confirming that Jessica Carter's transition protocol had been officially initiated and would proceed according to standard corporate structure. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in closure, then set the phone aside. Across the city, Jessica stood outside the Atlas Dynamics building for several seconds before moving. She looked up at the glass tower, now illuminated against the darkening sky, and for the first time saw it not as a workplace, but as a structure governed by systems she had underestimated. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, Daniel's name appearing on the screen, but after a moment, it stopped. She did not call back immediately. Instead, she lowered the phone slightly, standing still as the city continued around her unchanged, while everything she thought she understood about her position within it had already shifted beyond return. The night in Chicago had fully settled by the time Jessica Carter finally moved away from the front of Atlas Dynamics. The glass tower behind her glowed with soft interior lights, but it no longer felt like a place she belonged to, only a structure she had passed through. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, holding her phone without looking at the screen, as if waiting for it to explain something it could not. The city around her continued its steady rhythm, taxis passing, pedestrians crossing, conversations fading into the distance, yet she felt isolated inside a silence that had nothing to do with sound. When she finally looked down, Daniel Carter's name was still visible on her screen, unchanged, waiting. Meanwhile, Daniel drove along the riverfront with the windows slightly lowered, letting the cool air move through the interior of the car. The reflections of city lights stretched across the water beside him, shifting with every passing second, but his attention remained forward, steady, unbroken. There was no urgency in his movements, no lingering tension from the day. Everything that had needed to happen had already unfolded exactly as structured. His phone remained untouched on the passenger seat, though it had vibrated several times earlier. When it lit up again, he glanced at it briefly. It was Jessica calling. He did not immediately respond. Instead, he slowed the car near a quiet stretch of road and parked facing the river. Inside the vehicle, the sound of the city softened, replaced by a calm that felt almost detached from time. After a few seconds, the call stopped. A voicemail notification appeared instead. Daniel stared at it without opening it right away. He leaned back in his seat, eyes shifting toward the water, allowing a rare pause between action and acknowledgement. In that pause, he did not think about conflict or resolution. He thought about structure, about how systems adjust when inputs change, about how roles shift when assumptions are corrected. Eventually, he tapped the screen and played the voicemail. Jessica's voice came through, quieter than he was used to hearing, stripped of its earlier certainty. There was no confrontation in her tone, only recognition forming in real time. She did not ask him to return, nor did she attempt to reverse what had already been set in motion. Instead, she spoke carefully, acknowledging that she understood more now than she had earlier in the day. There was a pause in her message before she ended it, as if she was choosing words that no longer needed to defend anything. When the voicemail ended, Daniel set the phone down again without replaying it. The river outside continued flowing steadily, unaffected by anything that had happened above it. Jessica remained outside the building for several more minutes after ending the call. Eventually, she began walking, not quickly, but with a measured pace that reflected adjustment, rather than reaction. The city lights reflected off the glass surfaces around her as she moved away from Atlas dynamics, each step creating more distance between who she had been within that structure and what she now understood about it. There was no dramatic collapse of emotion, only a gradual settling of perspective. Daniel started the engine again, but did not immediately drive. He looked once more at the skyline, then at the river, and finally placed his phone face down on the seat beside him. When he pulled back into traffic, it was smooth, uninterrupted, as if the entire sequence of events had simply returned him to the natural flow of the city. Jessica's message was still unread in full detail, but it no longer required interpretation for him to understand its meaning. Some outcomes did not demand response. They only required recognition. And as Chicago continued moving around them both, separately now, there was a quiet understanding that what had changed that day was not the conversation itself, but the structure beneath it, and structures once revealed rarely returned to how they were before.